Okay, Paul. Hi. How are you?
Hi, Mark. I'm really well. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you. So we're going to have some. Today we're going to do some talks on some hand anatomy. I've done some drawing on my hand here, and as a hand surgeon, I'm going to sort of talk you through some of the intricacies of how the hand muscles work. You've got your guitar there, and we're going to talk about how we form bar chords, how we do open chords, how we do some more complex chords. And then we'll move on and talk about how to bend strings and what our fingers are doing when we do all of that. Is that okay?
That's fantastic. Let's go for it.
Good. So so this, I like drawing on my hands. It does come off quite easily with alcohol gel, thank God. So basically, this is what I was explaining to you earlier, Paul. Basically, there are three main sets of muscles which move our fingers like this. We've got the deep flexors, big ones are out here. They're outside your hand and they're called the extrinsic muscles. And then the intrinsic muscles are inside the hand here. So the extrinsic flexors that do this, they bend your fingers like that. These are these ones marked up here that come down on the palm side of all three joints. And I've marked the axes of rotation of each of these joints with an X like that. And so there's a deep flexor, which is on the palm side of each of those joints. And it basically, if you just contract the flexor on its own, the extrinsic flexor, it will just bend your wrist and your first joint and your second joint and your third joint of your finger, right? And then if you've got an extrinsic extensor out here and you pull on that one, it'll extend your wrist and it'll extend your first joint, second joint, and third joint of your finger. Now, these joints are called the metacarpophalangeal, or the MCP joint, the proximal interphalangeal joint, or the PIP joint, and the distal interphalangeal joint, or the DIP joint. So basically, throughout this talk, I'll be abbreviating them as MCP, PIP, and DIP joints, first, second, and third knuckle. Okay, so now that's all very well. If all we wanted to do was basically either extend our wrist and our fingers at the same time, or flex our wrist and bend our fingers at the same time, then we'd only need two sets of muscles. And that would just sort of do that. And they just need to be kept in check so that they did it evenly to each of the joints. And there are very complicated ligaments that regulate that, as I said to you previously about this oblique retinacular ligament of Landsmeer, which we can go on to in detail if you like. But essentially, it's got to be more complicated than that, hasn't it? Because when we're doing bar chords, you've got to get your finger straight at these two joints, at the PIP and the DIP joint, and you've got to bend it at the MCP joint here. And that wouldn't work with just a deep flexor because that would bend these two joints as well. And then we couldn't do open chords like this with our finger in this position with just the extensor because we need to flex at these two joints. So you've got to have a more elaborate mechanism for that. Unfortunately, there's this brilliant thing. So the intrinsic muscles are the ones that are inside the hand here, extrinsic out here, intrinsic down here. And the intrinsic muscles do loads of things. They spread our fingers apart and they bring them together, but they also do this really complex, super complex thing, which is because the way they work, they sit between the bones here and they bend this joint because they pass on the palm side of this axis of rotation. So when they contract, they do that to that joint, but they extend these two. And so when you've got a contracted intrinsic, you're in the what's called the intrinsic plus position, which is the classic bar chord position. And of course, you usually use the index finger to do the bar chord, don't you? But then you also do bar chords sometimes on the ring finger or the little finger. Do you want to just demonstrate how you do that as well? Do you ever use it on the middle finger, for example?
So here we've got a classic bar chord. This is an 8 major chord. But we can also use bar chords like this, for example. Or we could do an extension to get this. And then suddenly we have a completely different setup.
It's getting very complex. And what your hand's been asked to do there is now getting very complicated. So what we've got here is the intrinsic plus position, and the intrinsic minus position is this one here, where the intrinsic muscle has to be completely relaxed because it's having to stretch here, having to stretch over the back of this joint and over the back of that one. And when it is completely relaxed and the extensor tendon is working, then the flexor tendon bends these two joints and the extensor tendon bends this joint into extension. So you get this curved position like this, which you need quite a lot for those open chord shapes like the C shape, if you just want to show what the C shape is like now. So that, yeah, or and some of the ones on the lower strings, the D shape, for example, that would really bend right down like that. And that's mostly flexion. And actually what you're doing there is actually not extending at this joint. It's largely using the flexor without anything else. That's just all of them flexing down. But at the same time, you're having to have some wrist extension as well. So you're having to activate your wrist extensors, which are separate muscles, which I haven't talked about yet. And you've got separate control in that. So yeah. So then coming on to, I think that pretty much covers some of that basic anatomy. And then we'll just move on to a second chapter after this. Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Paul?
No, I think that's exactly what was happening when we play the guitar. And I think let's explore a little bit about this relationship between the fingers and the wrist.
Yeah,
I think that's really key. And as you know, that I'm really keen on having a straight wrist.
We'll come on to that.
But we can't always do that.
Yeah, we'll come on to that in a second. Okay, cool.